So up to this point, the talks have primarily been a kind of introduction to what is architecture about. But beginning with this talk, we're going to have a structure of the course that is kind of a third, a third, a third. We'll have a third of the lectures, and you'll be reading a book on that topic, and we'll have a test. And then we'll have a third on another topic, and you'll read a book, and we'll have a test. And a third on another topic, and we'll read a book and have a test. So this is really, this talk is an introduction to the first of those 1/3 of the class. So the three different parts of the class are really based on an idea that was proffered by a guy named Vitruvius, who was an architect in the Roman period, so around the time of Christ. And Vitruvius wrote 10 books on architecture. And in the 10 books, he said architecture is really made up of three major issues: firmness, commodity, and delight. And those are now known as the Vitruvian triad: firmness, commodity, and delight. Now, those are great words, and I love that. And even today, that idea still holds very, very true. That really is kind of the scope of what architecture is about. But maybe those words aren't exactly how we deal with architecture in the 21st century. We demand much more of architecture now than they did in Roman times, and maybe those words need to be expanded a little bit. So whereas Vitruvius talked about firmness, which he was really talking about, does the building stand up? Is it structurally sound? Is it firm? And certainly that's something we expect today, but we expect a lot of other physical considerations. We might think of firmness as a physical consideration, but now we expect the buildings to be temperate. If it's a hot climate, are they cool? Or if it's a cold climate, are they warm? We expect them to be energy efficient. We expect them to be ecologically sensitive. We expect them to deal with flooding and rain and all kinds of other issues. So it's more than firmness. And so in this class, we're going to be looking at a third of the course that's about physical considerations, a kind of elaboration of that notion of firmness. And then there will be a third of the class that will be on what Vitruvius would have called commodity. And again, I love that word, commodity. It's about accommodating what people need. It's commodious. But maybe we, in the 21st century, demand more than it just accommodate function, but we're worried about the psychological feeling of a place, whether it makes us depressed or whether it makes us happy. We're worried about kind of sociological, especially at a city scale. How does it create community? How does it help people relate to each other? In a work environment, how does it assist collaboration or deter collaboration? So it's a little more complicated than maybe commodious implies. So we're going to be taking a third of the class and talking about what we'll call human factors, which is really a broadening of that term of commodity. And then in the very first third of the course here, we're going to be talking about what Vitruvius called delight. And again, gosh, I love the word delight. Of course, architecture should be delightful. But we're going to be elaborating that to really talk about the entire range of aesthetic issues, which would incorporate delight, but also might be about things that make us feel other things than just delight, and emotion and aesthetics in a broader sense. And we're going to talk about where those come from and how architecture gets its form. So the key word in this first 1/3 of the course is going to be form. And then in the second 1/3 of the course, we'll be talking about physical considerations. In the third 1/3 of the course, we'll be talking about human factors. So today is kind of the kickoff lecture on issues of form. Now, in some ways, what we're talking about here is really beauty. It's the aesthetic side of architecture. How do we How do we make buildings that satisfy our aesthetic needs? And beauty is something we're accustomed to dealing with in our lives. Probably most of you, when you woke up this morning, put a comb through your hair to try to straighten things out a little bit, or maybe you messed it up to make things look a little more crazy. You probably maybe put on some makeup, maybe you shaved, you selected some clothes. All of these are ways that we're making kind of aesthetic judgments and making ourselves look a little better. This is something we're interested in our culture. I would say that most people would look at beauty as a very important sign of prestige. I've got a beautiful car. I've got beautiful kids. I've got a beautiful boyfriend. I've got a beautiful house. I mean, all of these are kind of signs of success or prestige or accomplishment. So we could look at beauty just in those terms, but I want us today to kind of see it in a bigger picture. Maybe there's something more important than that to this idea of beauty. And to talk about that, I want to roll back to a medieval philosopher named Abbot Suger. Abbot Suger was a churchman. He was an abbot in the Catholic Church, but he also was very much a philosopher. And he wrote and he talked about ideas that were very influential in his era. And there are two quotations from Abbot Suger I want us to talk about for a moment. The first is, "The dull mind rises to truth through that which is material." The dull mind rises to truth through that which is material. And the idea here is that for all of us, the way we discover things, the way we become sharper, more intelligent, is by our experience of the material world. This is really the roots of science and observation and perception. So the idea that the material world is out there helping us discover truth, and that our investigation of that, our experience of that, is key to understanding truth. A second quotation from Abbot Suger, he said, "Man reaches the contemplation of the divine only through the senses." Man reaches the contemplation of the divine only through the senses. And the notion here is that if we want to understand who God is, if we want to understand spiritual things, emotional things, we do that through our senses, through seeing the beauty of a sunrise, by seeing the dew on a spider's web, and just the sort of exquisiteness of that can help us understand who God is. So he elevates beauty beyond just, oh yeah, that's cool, that looks great, that's a sign of prestige. He says there, our experience of the material world and our sensing the world through our senses is a way we reach truth and the contemplation of the divine. Now that's a much more elevated thing. And he was someone who put his money where his mouth was. He's often called the father of the Gothic cathedral. And this was a whole movement in the medieval era to create these magnificent churches where your material experience of that space and that light and that character of that place would help you understand truth and the contemplation of the divine, would give you a connection to God. Now, this is a philosophy that was quite prevalent in the medieval era. And there's a little medieval verse that I first encountered when I was about your age, a college student, and it stuck with me ever since. So don't bother taking notes on this, but just listen to this medieval verse and the idea behind it. So the verse says, "If of thy mortal goods thou art bereft, and of thy store 2 loaves are left, sell one, and with the dole buy hyacinths to feed thy soul." Again, if of thy mortal goods thou art bereft, and of thy store 2 loaves are left. Sell one, and with the dole buy hyacinths to feed thy soul. The idea here is, of course, it's important to feed our body. That keeps us alive. But equally important as that bread is to buy something that feeds your soul, something that's beautiful, like flowers, like hyacinths. So this was pervasive in this period, and it really helps us understand the power of beauty to feed our soul and to help us understand truth and the contemplation of the divine. Now, there would be some people who would say, yeah, but you know, beauty is such a slippery thing. It's not something I can rationally understand. And you know, in some ways, I would argue with that. I think there are things that we can understand as broadly beautiful to many, many, many people. So for example, if we just take the senses, if you take the sense of smell, most of us would think that the smell of baking bread is very beautiful. Most of us would think that the smell of manure is disgusting and horrible. So there are some things in our senses that we can understand as beautiful or not. In the sense of feel, if you run your hand through mink, oh my God, it feels so sensuous and so beautiful. If you dip your hand in a vat of gutted entrails, and they're slimy and oozy, it's disgusting and not beautiful at all. If we hear the sound of a jackhammer, for most of us it's just annoying, it's horrible, it's nasty. But if we hear the sound of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it's beautiful. So clearly there are things in our experience of the senses that make us feel something is more beautiful or less beautiful. How can we understand that? And there have been many kind of social science studies that have tried to figure out in the visual sense, what are things that satisfy us or don't satisfy us in a visual way. So for example, there was a study done, I don't know, a decade ago, where they looked at the human body. Why do we think some bodies are beautiful and other bodies are not so beautiful? And are there some universals of this that we can even understand from any era or any society? And they did come up with what they thought were criteria that made a woman's body more beautiful or a man's body more beautiful. And they looked primarily at the ratio of waist to hips. And for a woman, if the ratio was 0.7 to 1, that was considered beautiful. In a man, if it was 0.9 to 1, that was considered beautiful. So the Venus de Milo, which is maybe by our standards, she's a little chunky, but her waist to hips is 0.7 to 1. That runway model that's tiny and thin, and we might consider her very beautiful these days, her waist to hip ratio is 0.7 to 1. You know, an athlete statue of a Roman athlete, that's going to be 0.9 to 1. A bodybuilder or Brad Pitt, that's going to be 0.9 to 1. So there are some universals even in the human body, independent of culture or of era, that we consider to be more beautiful. Now, is that in our DNA? Is that something we acquire and we learn? I don't know. I'm not as concerned about that, but I am concerned about us finding a way to really talk about beauty and to understand what makes something beautiful and to have a kind of vocabulary, and in particular in this class, a vocabulary for how we can talk about the visual or aesthetic character of something we're seeing, and that we can understand that these qualities help us see beauty or appreciate beauty in a way that we can understand and we can talk about. So pretty much for the rest of this talk, we're going to be looking at what I'm going to refer to as 12 elements of form. And these are some criteria, some words, some concepts that we can look at to understand what makes something beautiful. And I'm going to go through these, and believe me, for the rest of the class, you need to know these 12 elements of form. You need to understand them. You're reading in this first 1/3 of the class this book by Stina Eiler Rasmussen, Experiencing Architecture. These are building blocks of much of that book. It's impossible to really understand architectural form and talk about it without understanding these 12 elements of form. So the first of these is balance. This is not that it's perfectly symmetrical, but there's a sense of balance. One side is similar to the other. Proportion, this is the ratios, the proportions of things in a visual object. A third element of form is symmetry. Now it is that kind of, the right-hand side is exactly like the left-hand side, or the top is exactly like the bottom. Light, very important element of form. The contrast of light and darkness here as well. The next element is space, very important in architecture, this notion of space and the character of the space. The next one is shape, kind of sculptural or shapy quality of something. The next element of form is line. This is one many people overlook, but that kind of character of line through the building. It could be orthogonal, it could be organic or curvilinear. Color is certainly an important element of form that we respond to aesthetically. Materials, very, very important in architecture. What is it made of? How do we experience those materials aesthetically? Scale is another important element of form. The scale in relation to our body. Is it massive? Is it tiny? What is the scale? Another important element of form is rhythm, that kind of repetitive element. And that can be a regular rhythm, irregular rhythm. What is the rhythm of that aesthetic object? And texture. Again, very, that kind of tactile quality of architecture, almost like we can touch it, the texture. Okay, those are the 12 elements of form. And you definitely need to get those in your notes and get those in your head. And I can guarantee you, on the first exam, there is definitely going to be a necessity for you to apply those notions of these 12 elements of form in looking at and analyzing a building. But for the rest of this talk, we're not going to look so much at buildings. We're going to look at how we apply these 12 elements of form in 2 dimensions and how they might be expressed in paintings. So we're going to be looking at 2 paintings that I think are very beautiful and trying to understand how those 12 elements of form contribute to their beauty. The first of these is a landscape painting done in 1810 by John Constable, English painter. This one is in the Art Institute of Chicago. The painting's about that big. It's sometimes on display, but often not on display. But a very beautiful, very important painting by John Constable. So let's just walk through a handful of those elements of form, just to see how they apply in 2 dimensions. So this is definitely a well-balanced painting. The steeple of the church on this side is balanced by the larger trees on this side. It's a painting that has very, very powerful light quality. So we can just feel the sunlight coming in here and catching the whites of the clouds, catching the white in her dress here, catching the white on the end of the building there. If this is a pretty good photograph of the painting, but in the painting itself, all of this is a path that goes down into the trees, and there's dappled light kind of drawing your eye into the forest there. So another important element of form is light here. A third important element of form is texture. So the texture of the trees, the the texture of the clouds, the texture of the ground, and in a way, the texture of the paint. Constable is almost making a parallel between all of these things in the way the paint is applied to the canvas and creating a kind of texture that unifies the whole painting. A fourth really important element of form here is color. Obviously, it's kind of blues and greens and yellows primarily, and then a little bit of sort of reddish color through here, but very harmonious palette of colors, very pleasing, warm, rich palette of color. So we can look at that painting and say that's a beautiful painting. We can understand it a little more by saying, look at its texture, look at its light, look at its color, look at its balance, and understand what contributes to making that a beautiful painting. Another painting that definitely seems very beautiful to me, this is about the same era, done in 1814, the Grand Odalisque, done by Jean-Auguste Ingres. This one is in the Louvre in Paris, and it's mammoth. It's like 8 feet long and 4 feet tall, maybe 6 feet by 3 feet, something like that, but quite a large canvas, and done by Ingres at about the same time as Constable's painting. And again, we can look at it in terms of the elements of form. And some of the same elements of form are applied in a very different way in the case of the Grand Odalisque. Certainly balance. So the drape on this side is very balanced with the torso rising on the other side. Again, textures, very important. The texture of the fabric, smooth, sensuous kind of texture. The texture of her skin, the texture of the bedclothes. Completely different texture than Constable was using. This is now a very sensuous, very tactile, soft, smooth texture in the Grand Odalisque. Light is also very important here. We see the light falling on the torso, contrasting with the dark in the back here, and really making that torso pop out of the canvas. And the light catching the shimmering highlights of the fabric over here and of the bedclothes. Light's very, very important here. And again, color, and really some of the same colors, the kind of blues and greens that we saw in Constable's painting, mixed with little bits of the russet red and yellows, but very much the same palette of color that we saw in Stuck by Nayland. So again, those things we could see in both of these paintings that are contributing to beauty. But this one has a few other things. This one's very strong in terms of shape, the sort of rounded shape of her eye, the rounded shape of her breast, the rounded shape of her heel, the shape of the peacock feathers there, these kind of reiterated, round, sensuous shapes there. Line is very strong here, that long, sinuous line of her arm, of her leg, of her hip, the lines in the fabric there. Again, that's a very powerful element of form. We could probably take almost every element of form and apply it to the Grand Odalisque, but you get the point. Now, the idea here is that when you look at a visual object, whether it's a painting or whether it's a building, you can say, wow, that's beautiful. Now, what is it that's contributing to the beauty? Is it the shape? Is it the color? Is it the light? Is it the texture? What am I responding to here? And then as an architect, these are the tools you use to make a beautiful building. How can I use texture? How can I use light? How can I use shape? Those are things that can create beauty in architecture. So beauty, form in this regard, is not something enigmatic that we can't understand. It's something that we really can address, analyze, appreciate, and use as a way of making really beautiful architecture. Okay, see you next time.